What is it that we mean when we refer to the self? I'm going to make a bold claim, but my intuition tells me that it's true. And that is, I think that most people living in modern times have this intuitive conception of themselves as being, at least first and foremost, a mind. This conception of the self is not new. We would get it, I would argue, from the Enlightenment. And the way that this idea comes into the Enlightenment is through, originally, Christianity. Because in Christianity, we have the idea that developed over the centuries and, indeed over the millennia, that each individual has a soul. And thus is of, intrinsic value because this is a unique individual. And so, however, the morality and the politics of Europe in the Middle Ages tended to violate this idea, over time, this conception of the self as a unitary core of the human being, which is separate from the age and from the culture and even from one's upbringing, this was tempered over the long generations of the Christian reign over the European mind. We receive this idea in a philosophical form right at the start of Enlightenment philosophy from Descartes, who, among a few select others, he ushered in this new era of thought in Europe. He wrote a tract called Meditations on First Philosophy. It's one of the most famous philosophical works. Anyone who takes a first-year philosophy class will read it. Descartes, in this work, sets out with a methodology of doubt. So only by holding up every claim to doubt and seeing if we can, overcome those doubts through, reason, can we be assured that that claim is true? Descartes, therefore, sets out to doubt everything that can be doubted. And he, in this quest, he even doubts the information coming to him from his senses, because maybe, the sense organs might be lying to him. He comes to doubt the external world, and eventually even to doubt his own body. Finally, he settles on the one thing that he finds indubitable, which is the existence of his own mind, more specifically, the existence of his own thoughts. Cogito ergo sum is the famous phrase. Descartes' bedrock of knowledge, I think, therefore I am. The thoughts which Descartes experiences are therefore proof of a thinker that is capable of thinking those thoughts. There must be, some source of them. At least that's how the reasoning goes. And therefore, Descartes exists in the form of a mind. Now, what is commonly taught when we teach, what the significance of Descartes is, I think the attitude towards Descartes' significance is really, it's encapsulated in a comment by Schopenhauer. And he said, quote, Descartes is rightly regarded as the father of modern philosophy, primarily and generally because he helped the faculty of reason to stand on its own feet by teaching men to use their brains, in place whereof the Bible, on the one hand, and Aristotle, on the other, had previously served, end quote. And this is true. I would agree with Schopenhauer's assessment here. Descartes took, at least explicitly in his text, he takes nothing for granted. And in so doing, he sets this example of challenging the received wisdom and believing, only in that which one knows to be true through their own experience, through their own knowledge and intuitions. But what seems to be most important in how we understand a philosopher is largely a matter of what we choose to focus on. And I think that there is a pernicious effect of Descartes' meditations in what is commonly known as Cartesian dualism, also known as Mind-Body Dualism. This is the doctrine of a separation between the mind and the body. So Descartes, as we remember, has located the bedrock of certainty in the unquestionable existence of his own thoughts. So, even to raise the question of whether his thoughts are real requires the faculty of thought. And therefore, only thought is certain. So accordingly, he writes in his sixth meditation, quote, "On the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and exist without it." End quote. So that is an explicit statement of mind-body dualism. But we should recognize that Descartes' entire project is an exercise in this type of dualistic thinking. And this is really it's the trickiest aspect of Descartes' work and his methodology of doubt. He sets out to doubt every claim, but he takes it for granted that the experience of having a thought is beyond question, so to speak, whereas the experience of the senses is questionable. So that's a prejudgment. So this, when we talk about the experience of the senses, this includes, for example, the experience of pain, all the sensations and feelings and impulses of the body. And so he takes it as a sort of a presupposition that the body is doubtable, but the mind is not. And so that there's already a prejudicial association there of the self with the mind. And in a bit of, therefore, circular reasoning, thought, which is the activity of the mind, is considered the only certain thing in existence, and therefore the mind is itself certain. It's the core of the self, which is to say specifically the ego consciousness, because clearly Descartes doesn't mean every part of the mind. He can't mean the visual cortex, for example. If the faculty of sight is called into question, you can't include that part of the brain. So he simply means the part of the brain that engages in conscious, rational, discursive thinking. That's where the self resides. So that is what is indubitably real to Descartes. And whereas, as he says, the body is distinct from the mind, and Descartes even believes that he must therefore exist without a body, or without depending on his body existing. And so Descartes indeed taught men to use their minds, whereas before the Bible or Aristotelian philosophy was what they drew upon, but he taught them to use their minds because this very prejudice was in the primacy of the mind as the anchor of the individual self, and this fantasy of a mind without a body, in which I would simply point out as a quick digression, if we look at what we've actually have, empirical evidence for, what we've experienced, there are no minds that exist without bodies. Even if we were to create an AI with sentience, for example, that will be a sentience or a consciousness that exists as an emergent property or within projected by on the medium of circuits and hard drives and so on. And so whether, human beings are the only beings with consciousness on the planet, or whether maybe perhaps some other animals have sentience, every time we've encountered a mind, it is always a phenomenon generated by a body. So we have no examples of minds without bodies. On the other hand, we do have plenty of examples of bodies without minds. So consider the amoeba. Completely functional organism. It has a body. It is an entity with clear boundaries for its being, but which does not do any, thinking or self-reflecting at all. And you can go from the amoeba and you can scale up to more and more complex life forms for a long time before you get to anything even approximating, having something that we would call sentience, at least from all observation. So where is Descartes getting, then, this idea of the self as essentially a conscious mind which is separate and distinct from anything physical, and something which exists without, any dependence on the physical body? What does that sound like? In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's a passage called Despisers of the Body, and we find, quote, "Body am I and soul, so saith the child," end quote. So more than 1,000 years before Descartes, we had the writings of, for example, the later Stoics, such as Epictetus, who believed that the human being was a soul carrying a corpse, as he said. Corpse, maybe this is a somewhat coarse translation because the term corpse comes from corpus, which of course means body. But the implication is that this is a vessel that is not animate of its own accord. It has to be, animated by the Spirit. And then we have, the Apostle Paul, where he clearly establishes that the sinful flesh is the cause of sin, and that the true individual, the true human being, is the immortal soul, which is quite separate from the flesh. We had the writings of Aquinas, who located original sin as the cause of man's, moral waywardness, and explicitly laid out that we inherit that original sin through our flesh, through our descendants from Adam. And so this all existed for a long time. What Descartes was doing was simply updating the soul superstition, as Nietzsche would have called it, into a new form, which was the form of the ego superstition. It's exactly the same idea in many respects, but rather than justifying it theologically, Descartes attempted to justify it logically. He even said in his preface to the faculty of Sorbonne that he included this preface before the Meditations, and it's somewhat controversial because some would say he was just trying to appease the faculty, because this was an era when, you could very easily be accused of heresy or apostasy or what have you. But he includes in this preface that the point of the work was to prove the existence of the immortal soul to the infidel. And that if we were to simply depend on the argument that the Bible tells us the immortal soul is real, then the infidels would accuse us of circular reasoning. Now, there's still debate over what Descartes really believed, and I have my own thoughts on this. But I think it's difficult to argue that Descartes did not, either consciously or unconsciously, include his own intellectual prejudices about what the self is. And these were influenced, undoubtedly, by his enculturation and his upbringing in a deeply Christian civilization. And that is the self as the mind, this thinking, non-extended thing which is separate from the body. And with that act of secularizing the Christian framework for understanding the self, Descartes made it possible for that view to persist even into our secular age, which is why I would argue, as I did at the beginning, that especially to us modern people, we who think of ourselves as rational, as free agents, as moral agents, as able to be independent from our time and our place and our culture, beings with a true self that we can discover and so on. Among us, Descartes' influence still lives on in that form, in the secular view of the soul, which is the ego. And so I've been talking for quite a while, and we haven't gotten to the star of our podcast, Mr. Friedrich Nietzsche, except only a little bit. And so this is where Nietzsche comes in. So I read that one line from that chapter of Zarathustra, Despisers of the Body, but I'm going to read a little bit more of what comes after that, because Zarathustra here lays out all the ways in which Nietzsche defies and opposes this Enlightenment view of the self. And so this is Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Book 1, Part 4, Despisers of the Body. Quote, "The awakened one, the knowing one, says, 'Body am I entirely, and nothing more, and soul is only the name of something in the body.' The body is a great wisdom, a plurality in one sense, a war and a peace, a flock and a shepherd. An instrument of your body is also your small wisdom, my brother, which you call spirit, a little instrument and plaything of your great wisdom. Ego, you say, and are proud of that word, but the greater thing, in which you are unwilling to believe, is your body with its great wisdom. It says not ego, but does it. End quote. I'm going to skip a little further down in the passage for the sake of brevity. But, quote, ever hearkens the self and seeks. It compares, masters, conquers, and destroys. It rules and is also the ego's ruler. Behind your thoughts and feelings, my brother, there is a mighty Lord, an unknown sage. It is called self. It dwells in your body. It is your body. There is more wisdom in your body than in your deepest philosophy. And who then knows why your body requires your deepest philosophy? Your self laughs at your ego and its proud prancings. What are these prancings and flights of thought to me, it says to itself? A byway to my purpose. I am the leading string of the ego and the prompter of its notions. The self says to the ego, feel pain, and thereupon it suffers and thinks how it may put an end thereto. And for that very purpose, it is meant to think. The self says to the ego, feel pleasure. Thereupon it rejoices and thinks how it may ofttimes rejoice. And for that very purpose, it is meant to think. End quote. So, it's a very deep passage, but I'd like to break down, there's 4 characteristics of the self that Nietzsche describes here. And I'd like to kind of isolate them and highlight them. The picture that he gives through all these 4 dimensions, it rejects that traditional Enlightenment view that we've all received consciously or unconsciously through our upbringing and enculturation. So first of all, the self is identified explicitly with the body, obviously. It is not a detached, abstract concept. Your self is not a consciousness trapped in a body. The self isn't a mind driving a body. It's not even a mind at all. Self is the body. The mind happens to be part of that body as an emergent property of the brain and its consciousness. And Nietzsche has his own ideas of how that consciousness developed, which we'll get into a little bit. But the key thing in this first point is that the self is coterminous not with the consciousness in the Nietzschean view, but with our physiological existence. So it's not an unfortunate accident that our rational mind was incarnated into this biological framework. It's not a curse. It's not a result of sin or anything like that. The mind is an emergent property of life. Secondly, here Zarathustra contrasts his view of the self with the view of the ego consciousness, the view that holds it up to be the master of the self. So we're not denying the ego consciousness here, far from it. It's the view of the ego as the master. Contained in this view that the human person is first and foremost a mind is the idea of the ego consciousness as the master of the body. And what tends to come with this view is the idea of a central governor over the self. Because if what you are is not your biological form, your bodily form, but a mind controlling this bodily form, that creates the idea of this mind as similar to a master giving an order, similar to a king or a boss. And that's what consciousness imagines itself to be, and Nietzsche here rejects that. The third angle to this is it's sort of a corollary to that rejection of the self as the master. It's an attack on the unitary picture of the self. Zarathustra describes the self, on the contrary, as a multiplicity. He says it's a, quote, plurality with one sense, a war and a peace, a flock and a shepherd, end quote. So there's not one central ruler, not one master over what we call the self, at least not necessarily. Rather, we have instincts and urges and demands from our physiology. These things are all included under what Nietzsche calls drives. So we have biological imperatives driving us, and this is the true nature of human being. These different needs are sometimes complementary, but sometimes they're contradictory. And so the result is that we have what you might call a number of subpersonalities beneath the surface of consciousness. The way we experience these subpersonalities is in the way, in which, for example, everyone has different faces to them, or different ways, in which, your diet or your appetite can affect your mood or your outlook. We sometimes have one drive pull us very strongly in one direction, and then, another contradictory drive tries to pull us in another direction. And, that results in the feeling of feeling divided or feeling ambivalent, feeling unable to act. Or maybe you do act and then you feel regret later, and so on and so forth. This view of the self is not a unity, but a multiplicity of drives distributed throughout the body, which emerge into consciousness as the conscious mind tries to make sense of all these different centers of willpower, making their needs felt upon the individual. And so, like, the fourth aspect that I see in this passage, the fourth aspect of the self that Zarathustra outlines here is finally that the body is the sole cause of consciousness, and that in fact all consciousness comes into being through these unconscious physiological drives. Blind, unconscious physiological processes are, as he calls them, the, quote, leading string of all the mind's notions. So the Enlightenment view, the typical view, might be that the ego consciousness is this independent entity. It gives orders, and while we might admit that, as just being clever animals that still are in physical bodies, sometimes we have contradictory or competing urges, but we tend to think the mind can resist these of its free will, and that through our reason we can control all of these urges. And ultimately that you have a rational choice on how to act on those urges. Nietzsche says no. Consciousness is not a controlling governor. It's only a byproduct. It's a post hoc narration that we tell to ourselves, weaving this story of a coherent single self out of these disparate competing threads, which are all these different drives. And these drives are themselves unconscious and irrational, as we've said. So what we've done here in giving this Nietzschean image of the self is opened up a can of worms, because while it may be fun to simply deny many of the core beliefs about the self that are held within Western society, this is not enough, what we've said so far, to be explanatory. There are a lot of unanswered questions still lingering, and explaining just how these drives act in concert with one another, and explaining whether we can actually subdue or control these drives, or how might one go about doing so. Further, how does Nietzsche feel about these drives? Ought we attempt to subdue them? Or, as he says, tyrannize over them? Are some drives, good and some bad, and so on and so forth? Now again, to really drill down into the meaning of what we're talking about here, when we're talking about drives, we're talking about instincts, impulses. Another common word in antiquity that maybe we don't use as much in common parlance today would be the passions. The passions in modern terminology we might think just refer to emotions or to sentiments. But in ancient terms, the passions also included things like impulses. They were also called the affects. So your hunger, your thirst, your sexual desires, and so on. In addition to the driving power of emotional states like anger, sadness, greed, and so on. These are all what we mean when we're talking about drives. Now we'll find that, investigating this question, how Nietzsche sees these drives in relationship to our reason, and how it is that they make up what we call the self. We'll find that his unpublished notes are incredibly useful here. And so if we remember, the unconscious drives are the strings pulling along our conscious thought, as it's the metaphor he uses in Despisers of the Body. And so whereas the Cartesian Enlightenment view, and thus the Christian view, is to see the body and its drives as separate from our intellect and our reason, in Nietzsche's view, the drives produce our intellect and our reason. Nietzsche writes in a note that can be found in Will to Power number 387, quote, "The misunderstanding of passion and reason, as if the latter were an independent entity, and not rather a system of relations between various passions and desires, and as if every passion did not possess its quantum of reason," end quote. It's a fairly self-explanatory passage, but the important detail at the end of what I quoted there is that every drive has its own quantum of reason, its own small measure of reason that it brings into the consciousness. So it's a very different explanation of the origin of thought than the construal of thought as evidence of the existence of a single unitary consciousness, from which is produced thoughts. In Nietzsche's view, every drive has its own form of reasoning, so to speak. It contains within itself the goal at which it aims, and the drive toward this goal pushes the human organism to apply its reason towards achieving that goal. Each drive has its own sort of form of logic. We can find an elaboration on this idea in Nietzsche's published canon of works. This is in The Gay Science, Book 3, number 111. There's a section called Origin of the Logical. And here Nietzsche expounds the position that we covered last week, actually, and that is that our knowledge and our drive to seek knowledge, and thus to think logically, is a second-order result. It's a byproduct of drives which are themselves irrational. And so Nietzsche here, in this passage, marvels at how unlikely it would be to generate a drive towards logic and skepticism in a biological organism. And he ends up questioning whether the process of thinking, when we engage in it today, is, in fact, an exercise in logic at all, or whether our minds have simply become very good at concealing the battle between competing drives that manifests itself as rational decision-making. So now the passage, Origin of the Logical, I'll quote this in a slightly edited down form, again for time. Quote, "How did logic come into existence in man's head? Certainly out of illogic, whose realm originally must have been immense. Innumerable beings who made inferences in a way different from ours perished, and for all that, their ways might have been truer." End quote. Further down he says, quote, "At bottom, every high degree of caution in making inferences and every skeptical tendency constitute a great danger for life. No living beings would have survived if the opposite tendency, to affirm rather than suspend judgment, to err and to make up things rather than wait, to assent rather than negate, to pass judgment rather than be just, had not been bred to the point where it became extraordinarily strong. The course of logical ideas and inferences in our brain today corresponds to a process and a struggle among impulses that are, taken singly, very illogical and unjust. We generally experience only the result of this struggle because this primeval mechanism now runs its course so quickly and so well concealed." End quote. The last paragraph there is an incredibly subversive idea, against the idea of all human beings as rational or moral agents. And that is to say, agents acting with libertarian freedom of the will based on conscious reflection. Because Nietzsche's conclusion here is basically that when you make a decision, what is really happening is not that you have a self in the form of a logical governor, which we might call the ego, which, presides over two different desires and decides between them, sort of like, King Solomon mitigating disputes among his subjects. Rather, Nietzsche would argue that that picture is a fantasy. The experience of being in a dilemma between two decisions is simply two drives within your body that are competing, and they both exercise as much power as they can to overcome the competing drive and to present a certain course of logic to the brain that then compete with one another. And in the end, one of them overcomes the other, and then your conscious mind narrates a post hoc story around what just happened. It gives a logical explanation of why one drive was selected and not the other. But in fact, nothing was selected in the proper sense of the word. What happened was a contest. One drive was stronger than the other. Nietzsche thinks that's what's really happening. Next, in Nietzsche's notes, these are from 1887 to 1888, we have another contemplation on how we hide this reality of the self as a multiplicity of competing bodily impulses. We hide it through what Nietzsche calls fictions, which we tell ourselves. He says that it is the fact that we are so prone to the errors of consciousness that we continually fall victim to these distortions of reality. But this passage, in addition to that, it really sharpens the resolution of this picture of the self that he's given in a very profound way. So I'll quote this entire note, which is contained in Will to Power number 674. Quote, "In the tremendous multiplicity of events within an organism, the part which becomes conscious to us is a mere means, and the little bit of virtue, selflessness, and similar fictions are refuted radically by the total balance of events. We should study our organism in all its immorality. The animal functions are, as a matter of principle, 1,000,000 times more important than all our beautiful moods and heights of consciousness. The latter are a surplus, except when they have to serve as tools of those animal functions. The entire conscious life, the spirit along with the soul, the heart, goodness, and virtue, in whose service do they labor? In the service of the greatest possible perfection of the means of nourishment, means of enhancement of the basic animal functions, the enhancement of life. What one used to call body and flesh is of such unspeakably greater importance. The remainder is a small accessory. The task of spinning on the chain of life, and in such a way that the thread grows ever more powerful, that is the task. But consider how heart, soul, virtue, spirit practically conspire together to subvert this systematic task, as if they were the end in view. The degeneration of life is conditioned essentially by the extraordinary proneness to error of consciousness. It is held in check by instinct the least of all, and therefore blunders the longest and the most thoroughly. To measure whether existence has value, according to the pleasant or unpleasant feelings aroused in this consciousness, can one think of a matter extravagance of vanity? For it is only a means, and pleasant or unpleasant feelings are also only a means." End quote. So remember, when in the passage Despisers of the Body, Zarathustra says that the true self says, "Feel pain here," and then the organism feels pain. He clarifies here in this note that pleasure and displeasure are merely means. And what does that mean? It means that the dissatisfaction from failing to fulfill a drive, either because one is, stifled in fulfilling it, or because maybe there's resistance that they can't overcome, or because another drive within them is preventing it. Or we might consider, on the other hand, the pleasure one feels when a drive is fulfilled. The satisfaction of victory in battle, or the satisfaction of sex, or of a good meal. All our other animal impulses. These are all means that the drives use to push the human organism in a direction or to pull it away. And it's the height of vanity for consciousness, which is, so to speak, perhaps in an oversimplified way, a false self. It's vanity for consciousness to claim, reality has no meaning because it's characterized by suffering. Because the true self, the body and its drives, that is the thing that creates this suffering. And suffering is a subjective experience, and it's the creation of one's nervous system. And it's created in service of these drives. Nietzsche reminds us, this is in another one of his notes. You can find this in Will to Power 699 if you want to read more about this. But he talks about how pain is not an objective phenomenon. It's a place sign used by the nervous system. So it's a reaction generated by our own physiology for a given purpose. It's not actually an external reality. And so these drives aren't just the creators of our conscious thought, which is a fact that we like to ignore whenever possible, but they're also responsible for our entire subjective experience, including that which is not usually considered a form of thought. And so, physiological experiences, pain, pleasure, hunger, sexuality, and so on. And so we might take note before considering Nietzsche's arguments further. Christianity and the later Stoics, they're sort of, I would say, a big influence on the Christians, and really mind-body dualists of all stripes, have always considered the passions to be, in general, dangerous, and at times, just outright harmful or undesirable, and almost always as a threat to reason. In the worst possible terms, which is to say, in this case, in Christian terms, the passions are of the devil. And so Epictetus says, if we use him as a representative for the Stoics again, he says that the passions and their tumults render one incapable of listening to reason. Or we might look to St. Paul, associating the passions explicitly with sin and with the devil in the flesh, so to speak. Particularly, he had an obsession with sex. He famously said that monogamy was acceptable as a way of life, but that celibacy was even more holy. So to Paul, it would be best if sex and reproduction were left out of human life altogether. But as he says, quote, better to marry than to burn, end quote. So Nietzsche has harsh words, both in his notes and in his published works, for this kind of attitude. In his notes from 1888, we find this section which can be found in Will to Power number 778, quote, fear of the senses, of the desires, of the passions, when it goes so far as to counsel us against them, is already a symptom of weakness. Extreme measures always indicate abnormal conditions. What is lacking, or crumbling, here is the strength to restrain an impulse. If one's instinct is to have to succumb, i.e. to have to react, then one does well to avoid the opportunities or seductions for it. And a little further down, I'm going to skip through the passage, quote, excess is a reproach only against those who have no right to it, and almost all the passions have been brought into ill repute on account of those who are not sufficiently strong to employ them, end quote. He goes on a little further to describe in this passage how a supremely healthy person is somebody with one drive reigning over the whole person. So, in that drive service stands the entire self, which is to say the entire body and all of its other drives. What we might call a sick person, or what Nietzsche might call a sick person, meanwhile, is somebody torn between multiple drives of equal strength. So that person is not going to be able to act very efficiently. And then he lists a third type of person as somebody who can juxtapose seemingly contradictory drives and allow them to coexist within one body. And, the most masterful can make them work in concert or in cooperation. He says this is the most interesting type of person, the most interesting to him. But remember, he begins the passage, the first thing he attacks those who have a fear of the passions. He says that those who fear the passions are those who, really another way of putting it, they're the people who have passions that they're not strong enough to control. And we could see that as being similar to the situation of the second type of person he outlines, the sick soul, somebody with multiple drives in competition, such that they don't possess any one drive strong enough to subdue their unwanted or problematic drives. They don't have one overbearing drive to which all the others can be brought into submission. And they don't have the ability to juxtapose seemingly contradictory drives because, perhaps they're not strong enough for that either. And so this is the situation with Christianity, and really with all the forms of mind-body dualism that denigrate the passions. That's Nietzsche's psychoanalysis of them, so to speak. And so there's a section of Twilight of Idols, and that book was also published in 1888. So he's writing this or publishing it the same year of the note that I just read. And there's a section in Twilight of Idols called Morality as Anti-Nature, or you could render it as morality as the enemy of nature. In this passage, Nietzsche describes this Christian way of thinking as the hostility toward the passions. And he contrasts it to the view of earlier Hellenic Greeks. So, this characterization of the Greeks would not include, for example, the later Stoics. But he says that in Hellenic Greek culture, they spiritualized their passions, which is to say they interpreted their passions as something elevated, something which was partaken of by the gods themselves, something which was sacred and holy. So he writes, for example, in this section that the Greeks, or for the Greeks, the, quote, the sexual symbol was the venerable symbol, par excellence, end quote. Whereas Christianity does the opposite. It attacks the passions when it comes to sexuality especially. And so then Christianity has this fetishization of being virginal, especially for women. So we could say it spiritualizes the drive towards chastity, of course. And then, we had Paul's views, which we just discussed earlier. But so Nietzsche elaborates on this Christian attack on the passions here in this passage. Quote, "The most famous formula for this stands in the New Testament, in that Sermon on the Mount, where, let it be said incidentally, things are by no means regarded from a height. It is said there, for instance, with an application to sexuality, if thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. Fortunately, no Christian acts in obedience to this precept. To annihilate the passions and desires simply on account of their stupidity, and to obviate the unpleasant consequences of their stupidity, seems to us today merely an aggravated form of stupidity. We no longer admire those dentists who extract teeth simply in order that they may not ache again. On the other hand, it will be admitted with some reason that on the soil from which Christianity grew, the idea of the spiritualization of passion could not possibly have been conceived. The early church, as everyone knows, certainly did wage war against the intelligent in favor of the poor in spirit. In these circumstances, how could the passions be combated intelligently? The church combats passion by means of excision of all kinds. Its practice, its remedy, is castration. It never inquires, how can a desire be spiritualized, beautified, deified? In all ages, it has laid the weight of discipline in the process of extirpation, the extirpation of sensuality, pride, lust of dominion, lust of property, and revenge. But to attack the passions at their roots means attacking life itself at the source. The method of the church is hostile to life." End quote. So notice the argument here. At the outset, Nietzsche describes how the church wanted to annihilate the passions and the drives, and he says this was on account of the stupidity of the passions. In Human All Too Human, which is a much earlier book, he sheds some light on what he's talking about here. He argues there that what we call good actions are sublimated evil actions are good actions become coarse and stupid. And so what he means by this is that what we call evil is the result of people acting upon impulses in a way that is disruptive to the common good. And we've developed this idea of what the common good consists of through this long process of civilization. In civilizing mankind, we've demanded that man behave within certain boundaries, which involves suppressing certain impulses, not giving in to those impulses. His criticism of Christianity then is that they deal with this problem in a very stupid and coarse manner. So it enhances it aggravates the stupidity of those passions in a way, or just the overall stupidity of the situation. In Nietzsche's notes from 1880 to 81, there's a section, I found this in the Portable Nietzsche, page 74, but it might be in Will to Power as well, I'm not really sure. But Nietzsche says here, quote, It is the blindness of the desire that one despises, end quote. And he elaborates that, when we see people act in a way that is, we can say, like blindly passionate, or following their passions in a way that is contrary to the rules of society, we're perceiving the animal inside the person. And naturally, people will resent it when they're forced to confront our animal nature, because we associate ourselves first and foremost with the rational ego consciousness as this thing that's separate and governs over our animal bodies. But so Nietzsche goes on to write in this same note I've been talking about, quote, "The social mores are seen to demand that one bear the displeasure of an unsatisfied desire, that the desire be able to wait. To be immoral means, therefore, in this case, not to be able to bear a displeasure despite the thought of the power that makes the rules. A feeling is supposed to be subdued by a thought, more precisely by the thought of fear, whether it be fear of the sacred mores or of the punishment and the shame threatened by the mores. In itself, it is not at all shameful, but natural and fair that a desire be satisfied immediately." End quote. So that is the picture of how an animal engages with its drives or impulses. The impulse is felt, and the animal immediately tries to satisfy it. If it doesn't satisfy the drive, it's because the animal faces resistance. So we might consider, if a lion fails to breed because he can't defeat the reigning male of a pride, it's not that he has not fulfilled his sexual desire out of an intellectual, consideration. It's simply that he could not overcome the resistance to fulfilling the desire. But he'll try with all his might, and without any shame or self-reflection at all. Human beings, though, through consciousness and through this project of civilization, on the other hand, we now make our desires wait. And it's through this process, Nietzsche hints, that we have sharpened and refined our sense of consciousness and strengthened our faith in reason, or in morality, rather, as the governor over our desires. Whereas, Nietzsche doesn't actually see any free will or any reason at all in this picture. In the morality governing our actions, the motivating factor is actually fear. Fear of the community and its power to punish, or fear of the religion, the religion that's made sacred that which is beneficial to the community, or made taboo that which is harmful to it. And it inculcates these matters of conscience into the minds of the people. And so the free choice of the intellect, in Nietzsche's view, is not how the self deals with the passions at all. But we've come to see it that way, because we came to see the passions as dangerous in and of themselves, especially the particularly unpredictable and violent ones. And that's because these impulses pose a threat to civilization, and civilization is the very force that shaped our consciousness. And so we learn that we must become these moral agents that overcome our passions. Returning to the unpublished notes, there are two in a row in Kaufman's Will to Power, or his edition of Will to Power, that begin to hint at Nietzsche's solution to this problem, that being the problem of our pathological relationship to the drives. So first we have Will to Power number 384. Quote, "Overcoming of the effects? No, if what is implied is their weakening and extirpation, but putting them into service, which may also mean subjecting them to a protracted tyranny." End quote. And so here Nietzsche is suggesting that there's a distinction to be made between extirpation, or, emasculation, or castration, however you want to say it, the principle of plucking out the eye that offends thee, versus another process, which he characterizes as putting the drives into service. The next note is Will to Power 385, quote, "Moral intolerance is an expression of weakness in a man. He is afraid of his own immorality. He must deny his strongest drives because he does not yet know how to employ them. Thus, the most fruitful regions of the earth remain uncultivated the longest, end quote. So we might remember how Nietzsche talks about the Greeks and how they spiritualized the passions. And while he thinks it was not possible for the Christians to do the same, perhaps some approach similar to that might become available to us post-Christianity. And so here he's pointing to the idea that we can direct the passions through channels that can be productive for the entire community of drives within the body. There's a very important passage that describes this process that's found in the Dawn. It's aphorism number 109. And this aphorism begins with Nietzsche declaring that he has found no more than 6 distinct methods of dealing with what he calls a vehement drive. And so that is a drive which demands some kind of response from the organism because it's so powerful. I highly recommend reading this whole passage if you're interested in this, because Nietzsche goes into great detail about each of these methods, and he describes a few historical figures as examples of certain methods. In the interest of time, I'm simply going to quote from the end where he summarizes all the methods. But then importantly, he contextualizes all this within this view of the self that we've been sort of elaborating through poring over all of Nietzsche's notes and published works. And so he gives this view towards the end, which helps clarify a little bit more. Quote, shunning the opportunities, regulating the impulse, bringing about satiety and disgust in the impulse, associating a painful idea, such as that of discredit, disgust, or offended pride, then the dislocation of one's forces, and finally, general debility and exhaustion. These are the 6 methods. But the will to combat the violence of a craving is beyond our power, equally with the method we adopt and the success we may have in applying it. In all this process, our intellect is rather merely the blind instrument of another rival craving, whether it be the impulse to repose, or the fear of disgrace and other evil consequences, or love. While, quote, we thus imagine that we are complaining of the violence of an impulse, it is at bottom merely one impulse which is complaining of another, i.e., the perception of the violent suffering which is being caused us presupposes that there is another equally or more violent impulse, and that a struggle is impending in which our intellect must take part. End quote. So again, Nietzsche holds consistently to the view that the intellect takes part in these relations and the struggles between the drives, but it's not the master governing these relationships. It's a weapon or a tool taken up in the struggle. That being said, this doesn't mean that we all simply must, give in to the most base and vulgar forms of these impulses. Obviously, because otherwise the entire project of civilization never would have been successful to any degree. So obviously, as hinted at by the numerous methods of dealing with the vehement drives, there are means by which these drives can be pushed into productive channels. Walter Kaufmann writes in his book on Nietzsche that the quote, and this is on page 218, actual process of overcoming the impulses and the kind of control Nietzsche had in mind, end quote. This consists of a word that is often falsely attributed to Freud's coinage, or concept that's falsely attributed to Freud's coinage. But Kaufmann sources this concept instead to Nietzsche. And that word, that concept is sublimation, or sublimieren. The word comes from a Latin term, sublimare, and that's how it entered the German language. Now, plenty of people used the term sublimation before Nietzsche did. This includes Goethe, Novalis, and Schopenhauer. Goethe says that, quote, human feelings and events could not be dramatized or brought onto the stage in their raw, original naturalness because, quote, they must be wrought prepared, and sublimated, end quote. Schopenhauer used the term to say that his representations were, quote, sublimated into abstract concepts, end quote. But according to Kaufmann, it was Nietzsche who first gave it the specific connotation that it has today, which is the psychological connotation. Nietzsche was the first to speak, for example, of sublimated sexuality. And in this, we can surely recognize the prefiguration of Freud. Indeed, Freud read Nietzsche and was very much influenced by him. And so Kaufmann explains here what Nietzsche means by sublimation. This is on page 220, same book, same chapter. Quote, Nietzsche believed that a sexual impulse, for example, could be channeled into a creative spiritual activity instead of being fulfilled directly. Similarly, the barbarian's desire to torture his foe can be sublimated into the desire to defeat one's rivals, say, in the Olympic contests. It can even be sublimated into the rivalry of the tragedians who vie with each other for the highest prize, or into the efforts of a Plato to write more beautifully than the poets. And the entire Socratic dialectic could be construed as a sublimation of the same ancient striving to overwhelm one's foe, end quote. It kind of struck me as I was reading through some of these. To a contemporary audience, some of these observations may seem even kind of passé, like old hat. And they are. But that's simply because Nietzsche was well ahead of his time. He was ahead of all the psychological thinking on this topic. And it was through his new subversive model of the human being, however, of the self as the body, that he came to these insights, which were so influential on the psychoanalytic school, and which were so helpful in explaining, the behaviors and the pathologies of modern man. And so we should note, sublimation is not necessarily a good or a bad thing in this analysis. It is simply the self's way of coping with the power of civilization. The power of civilization, it confines and it curtails man's drives. And sublimation is a means for man to not destroy himself and to destroy others in the face of that insurmountable resistance. And it is insurmountable because in almost every case, the individual's desires will not be able to overcome the power of the entire society and its moral demands. So your drives will be curtailed by the boundaries of society. And so sublimation provides at least some means of channeling those drives into a productive, positive form. But the problem, of course, is that, as we've already noted, in dealing with this problem of how to manage all these competing drives, we continually wish to turn to the intellect and come up with some sort of intellectual solution. And this will always be thwarted by the fact that the intellect, for one, it's just not as strong as we think it is. It's not as much in control as we think it is. But secondly, and perhaps even more important, is the mere fact that we don't have conscious access to our own inner workings. We often experience the after effects of our unconscious drives on our behavior, and then our logic does its work to fabricate an explanation. The light of consciousness, when it's brought to bear on our actions, on our own character, it has so much concealed from it, and it's so misled by all these cultural fictions that we don't really have the power to disentangle all this inner tumult. We don't have the knowledge, really. Nietzsche discusses this problem in his book, The Dawn. And this is in aphorism number 119. Quote, "To however high a degree a man can attain to knowledge of himself, nothing can be more incomplete than the conception which he forms of the instincts constituting his individuality. He can scarcely name the more common instincts, their number and force, their flux and reflux, their action and counteraction, and above all, the laws of their nutrition. These remain absolutely unknown to him. This nutrition, therefore, becomes a work of chance. The daily experiences of our lives throw their prey now to this instinct and now to that, and the instincts gradually seize upon it. But the ebb and flow of these experiences does not stand in any rational relationship to the nutritive need of the total number of the instincts. Two things, then, must always happen. Some cravings will be neglected and starved to death, while others will be overfed. Every moment in the life of man causes some polypus arms of his being to grow and others to wither away, in accordance with the nutriment which that moment may or may not bring with it." End quote. A little further down in the same passage, Nietzsche adds, in what I consider a very profound couple of lines, he sums up this problem. Quote, "Our moral judgments and valuations are only images and fantasies concerning physiological processes unknown to us, a kind of habitual language to describe certain nervous irritations. That all our so-called consciousness is a more or less fantastic commentary of an unknown text, one which is perhaps unknowable but yet felt." End quote. Our consciousness, a commentary on an unknown text. I love that metaphor. And so we may notice also he says, that our moral judgments and valuations are, what does he call them? Images and fantasies concerning physiological processes. He actually, in the passage immediately preceding this, he's talking about dreaming and how when we dream, certain stimuli that, we hear the sound of a bell or we feel a, pain in our arm or something, and our mind, our dreaming mind, construes these sensations into an intelligible story. And he basically alleges, what if our waking mind and our dreaming mind are more or less the same in this respect? That our waking mind is doing the same process. And so that's what he means when he says it's images and fantasies concerning physiological processes. And so this passage should call to mind some of the material from the last episode that we did about the irrational foundations of our value judgments. So we might compare the passage I just read from the Dawn to the line I cited in the last episode from Beyond Good and Evil. This is Book 1, Aphorism 3, which I'll read again. Quote, "Behind all logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement, there stand valuations, or, more clearly, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life." End quote. So again, the rational stands on a foundation of the irrational. Another line along the same vein we can find in another one of these unpublished notes. This is Will to Power number 392, quote, "Moral values as illusory values compared with physiological values." End quote. So the physiological demand is the initial driver, and then we author a fantasy, or as he here calls it, an illusion, and that illusion is the moral evaluation. And so it's not the case, therefore, that any of the passions or the drives are inherently bad or harmful or evil. We simply have circumstances created either by geography or climate or culture or what have you, which may require some drives to be cherished and spiritualized, elevated, whereas others will be denigrated, considered shameful and evil. And so he writes in another note, Will to Power 375, quote, "All the drives and powers that morality praises seem to me to be essentially the same as those it defames and rejects." End quote. So there is no essential difference between the different competing drives. We author the moral assessment later as a product of consciousness, but in reality, or I guess first and foremost in reality, there's only a physiological struggle within us between competing sources of power. And so, having dismissed reason as thoroughly as Nietzsche has, we might ask whether there is any room for cultivation of virtue, which you would think would have to be undertaken by conscious means, whether we have any ability to intercede in this war with the passions. And again, this is an area where we need to reframe our thinking because language misleads us, because the we that I just spoke of that would be interceding, if you're still thinking of that me as this mind, as this ego consciousness, that's not how Nietzsche looks at it. He thinks that the you that intercedes is merely another drive. But again, that's not to take away your agency or to dispute the idea of the self as such. It's just relocating where the self is, which is in the body. So suffice to say, yes, there is hope, so to speak. Nietzsche elaborates further this is another passage in the Dawn. This is aphorism number 560. The passage is called, "What We Are Free to Do." Quote, "We can act as the gardeners of our impulses, and, which few people know, we may cultivate the seeds of anger, pity, vanity, or excessive brooding, and make these things fecund and productive, just as we can train a beautiful plant to grow along trellis work. We may do this with the good or bad taste of a gardener, and as it were, in the French, English, Dutch, or Chinese style. We may let nature take its own course, only trimming and embellishing a little here and there. And finally, without any knowledge or consideration, we may even allow the plants to spring up in accordance with their own natural growth and limitations, and fight out their battle among themselves. Nay, we can even take delight in such chaos, though we may possibly have a hard time with it. All this is at our option, but how many know that it is? Do not the majority of people believe in themselves as complete and perfect facts? And have not the great philosophers set their seal on this prejudice through their doctrine of the unchangeability of character?" End quote. So Nietzsche brings up at the end of that passage one of the key ideas of the Nietzschean self, which is entirely opposed to the unitary ego consciousness view of the self given to us through Christianity and the Enlightenment, and that is that the self is not this unchangeable, eternal, essential thing. This is part and parcel with the self as a multiplicity and not a unity. It doesn't have a stable, enduring core that is the same regardless of culture or regardless of one's age or their life experiences or physiological state. That's all nonsense to Nietzsche. The self is a competing multiplicity, and it's in constant flux, constant state of growth and development. And that means individual identity is changeable. And so this relates to Nietzsche's Heraclitean influence of rejecting being and viewing the world instead in terms of becoming. Rather than a soul, which is endowed with a certain essence and exists eternally, we are forever becoming new individuals. The apparent stability of one's character, to the extent that it appears that way at all, is in fact an illusion. It's an illusion created by logic, by the consciousness, by our desire to think of ourselves as consistent, coherent, predictable beings. It's rather scary to consider yourself a battleground of competing drives, the inner workings of which are concealed to your unconscious mind. The best you can be, what you're free to do is to be a gardener. Still, the roots are buried deep under the soil, but you can make these little micro decisions to push, give the nutrients to grow to certain impulses and drives. But, then who knows what you're going to do? The self becomes at once more down to earth, but also more mysterious. The self is a wonder of nature. It's not just another recapitulation to this story of people as special and divine and separate from all of nature, which in its way is kind of boring. Perhaps more to the point, though, Nietzsche sees this view of the self, this Enlightenment view, as impoverished. And the reasons why should be fairly clear by now. But there's one final passage of Nietzsche's that I'd like to quote from, and he emphasizes how this view of the self, this Enlightenment view, is another retreat from the real world. Because the real world is what Nietzsche considers to be this world of the senses, of the body, of the impulses. So when you remove those senses and you remove those impulses, and when you remove the body and its nervous system and its sense organs, what you have remaining is not pure consciousness or pure spirit. Contrary to what some philosophers would have you believe. And so this passage is from The Antichrist, number 14. Quote, "Formerly, the proof of man's divinity was found in his consciousness, in his spirit. To become perfect, he was advised to draw in his senses turtle fashion, to ease all intercourse with earthly things, to shed his mortal shroud. Then his essence would remain pure spirit. Here, too, we have reconsidered. The development of consciousness, the spirit, is for us nothing less than the symptom of a relative imperfection of the organism." And I'm going to skip down to the end of this passage as well, where Nietzsche says, quote, "The pure spirit is a pure stupidity. If we subtract the nervous system and the senses, the mortal shroud, then we miscalculate. That is all." End quote. So, what is implied by the idea of the true self as coterminous with the mind? It's this inevitable conclusion that the body is a mere hindrance to the true self, a limitation on something which, in its pure form is not limited. And so we can see how a state of being in resentment towards one's own physical limitations is contained within the body-mind dualism from the very start. But when you remove that, which is supposedly a limitation, the body, you're actually removing the real person, the true self. You're removing everything real about them, all of the raw material of their experiences, their feelings, their sensations. That's all the stuff of life. And so the problem with the Christian view, which is the same view as the Cartesian view that became the Enlightenment view, in which, in my opinion, most people still seem to hold, that we're just minds driving bodies, is that this position is fundamentally anti-life. And so whether we, accept the entire Nietzschean picture of the body and its drives that I've given over the course of this episode, whether you accept that or not, what Nietzsche was doing here, it was an attempt at explaining the whole human being and healing that divide between body and mind, which is irrational, in addition to all of its other things. He attempts this reconciliation by explaining how the unconscious drives and the ego consciousness are not opposites. One grows out of the other. The mind is not this separate magical thing. It's an emergent phenomenon of life. Minds exist within bodies. Reason and the passions are not opposing forces. Reason's a tool and an ordering force among the passions. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the passions are not an evil thing. The drives that we call good and the ones that we call bad, they all exist as indelible parts of the whole system, the whole person. And so, and more than that, when we bring into it the element of sublimation, perhaps all of our art, our philosophy, all of our cultural accomplishments, rather than being the product of calculated reason or moral duties or anything of that sort, are instead all the result of these same irrational passions. That's all, everybody. Signing off.